What if I told you that one battle forever changed the balance of power in England, destroying the baron's dream of controlling the king and cementing the absolute power of the monarchy? Throughout England's history, there was an unspoken and sometimes open war between the crown and its most powerful subjects, the barons. This struggle for power determined not only the political system, but also the lives of millions of people, turning the country into a powder keg. In the mid-13th century, this confrontation reached its peak, erupting into a large-scale civil conflict known as the Second Barons' War. On one side stood King Henry III, who sought absolute power, and on the other, the ambitious and charismatic leader of the baronial opposition, Simon de Montfort. At stake was the future of England, royal absolutism or baronial oligarchy. This dramatic confrontation culminated in a bloody battle on the banks of the River Avon, near the walls of Evesham Abbey. It was not just a battle, but a point of no return, where one leader fell and the Tudor dynasty, centuries later, gained the opportunity to rule without regard for Parliament. Watch the video to the end to learn how one great battle not only crushed the Barons' rebellion, but also cemented the absolute power of the monarchy, becoming a lesson for all future generations of English kings. What if everything you've been taught is outdated? English kings, starting with John Lackland, were constantly under pressure from their powerful barons. This confrontation was not just a quarrel over money or titles, but a fundamental dispute over who really held supreme power in the kingdom. The kings, inspired by continental monarchs, sought to rule alone, while the barons saw themselves as guardians of the traditional rights and freedoms enshrined in the Magna Carta. By the middle of the 13th century, Henry III was on the throne, a devout but weak politician whose reign was marked by unpopular foreign policy adventures and patronage of foreign favorites. The king spent enormous sums of money on his ambitions in Sicily and France, constantly demanding new subsidies and taxes from the barons. It was this financial burden that caused the greatest discontent among the English nobility. The barons, in turn, believed that the king ruled inefficiently and wastefully, undermining the stability of the kingdom with his rash decisions. They demanded not only a reduction in taxes, but also the creation of a permanent council that would control royal expenditures and appoint senior officials. In effect, the barons wanted to turn the monarchy into a controlled oligarchy. The leader of this opposition was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who was of French origin but had married the king's sister. De Montfort was a man of extraordinary charisma, a brilliant military leader and politician who managed to unite the scattered baronial factions under his banner. He did not simply oppose the king, he proposed an alternative model of government based on representation. In 1258, discontent erupted into open confrontation when the barons, led by de Montfort, forced the king to accept the provisions of Oxford. This document effectively transferred power to a council of 15 barons and provided for regular meetings of Parliament to discuss state affairs. It was a radical step that temporarily limited royal autocracy. However, King Henry III was not going to put up with the loss of power. He tried several times to repeal the provisions, using diplomatic tricks and the support of the Pope. Both sides were preparing for military confrontation, realizing that the question of supreme power could only be decided on the battlefield. Thus, England entered a period of civil war, where the focus was not on legal subtleties, but on the power of arms and military skill. Despite his foreign origins, Simon de Montfort managed to win the support not only of the high nobility, but also of the lower nobility, townspeople, and even university intellectuals. He transformed his movement from a selfish conspiracy of barons into something that could be called the prototype of a political party defending the common good of the kingdom. It was not just a rebellion, but a revolution in English political consciousness. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Do you agree with the arguments presented about the causes of the conflict between the king and the barons? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Want to know a secret that could change your view of English political history? The fact is that Simon de Montfort's main success was not his military talent, although he had plenty of that. De Montfort's true greatness lay in politics, in a boldness that no one before him had dared to show. It was this boldness that allowed him to enlist the support not only of the nobility, but also of those whom no one had previously considered worthy of participating in the government of the country. It was Simon de Montfort who first convened what we now call a representative parliament. For the first time in English history, not only barons and prelates were included in political governance, but also 2 knights from each county and 2 townspeople from each major city. For the 13th century, this was tantamount to a revolution. For the first time, England heard the voices of those who had been deprived of the right to speak for centuries. This step instantly made de Montfort the idol of the common people, urban communities, and lower-ranking knights, but at the same time caused alarm among his own supporters, the barons. They were ready to fight the king, but sharing power with people without titles was quite another matter. De Montfort understood perfectly well that for his power to be legitimate and long-lasting, it could not rely solely on a narrow circle of feudal lords. He needed the people. He needed a new political order. And he created it, even if it was under his iron control. His rule became a kind of dictatorship, but a dictatorship formed through representation, which was unprecedented in English history. He became the defender of the kingdom, a man who spoke on behalf of the nation and promised to protect it from royal arbitrariness. After the decisive Battle of Lewes in 1264, where de Montfort destroyed the royal army and captured King Henry III, England changed. The Earl of Leicester found himself with absolute power. He ruled ostensibly on behalf of the king, but in fact independently. The king's son, Prince Edward, was also taken prisoner. He was held captive as a guarantee of stability. For a whole year, England lived under the authoritarian but surprisingly reformist rule of de Montfort. He actively restricted the uncontrolled power of the great magnates, sought to centralize the country, and strengthen the rule of law. But power built on the captivity of a monarch cannot be stable. It is based on fear and transience. And soon, clouds began to gather around de Montfort. Many barons, who had recently fought shoulder to shoulder with him, now began to fear him. His authoritarianism, his confidence in his own destiny, his desire to control everything and everyone, all this was frightening. They saw before them a new tyrant, even more energetic and capable than the weak Henry III. There was also great dissatisfaction with the fact that de Montfort had given key positions to his sons and relatives. For the barons, this was a betrayal of the ideals for which they had gone to war. They wanted reforms, not the emergence of a new ruling dynasty from the Montfort family. Ultimately, the tension led to a split. The key figure was Count Gilbert de Clare, a young but incredibly ambitious leader whose support was critical to de Montfort. De Clare expected that after victory he would become one of the country's top leaders, but de Montfort, concentrating power within his own circle, left him no room for growth. Resentment, ambition, and political calculation pushed de Clare to conspire. He secretly entered into negotiations with Prince Edward, a man whom many considered to be the true leader of the future generation. It was a dangerous game. But de Clare understood that if Edward could be freed, England would have a legitimate pretender capable of uniting all those who were dissatisfied. A chain of intrigues, secret agreements, night meetings, and covert movements began. De Montfort, busy strengthening his political regime, did not notice that the ground beneath his feet was rapidly slipping away. The liberation of Prince Edward was not just a threat. It was a blow to the very heart of his power. While de Montfort was busy with reforms and convening assemblies, the conspirators were step by step creating a plan that would destroy everything he had built. And now the main question. How did a sweet treat turn into a field kitchen? And how did Prince Edward escape from captivity with only a horse, cunning, and an iron will? Stay with us. In the next chapter, you will learn about one of the most daring escapes in English history. You've definitely never heard of this unique secret. At the end of May 1265, Simon de Montfort's entire power hung by a thread, and that thread was tied to one man, Prince Edward. The heir to the throne was being held under guard at Hereford Castle, but the conditions of his captivity were more honourable than harsh. He was allowed to go for walks and even practice horse riding, which gave him the opportunity to devise a daring and almost unbelievable escape plan. Edward was the complete opposite of his father, Henry III. He was tall, strong, energetic, a natural warrior and a charismatic leader, hardened in battle. He understood that as long as he was in captivity, his supporters would be unable to unite, and therefore only his release could revive the royal party. The escape plan was simple and based on routine. During his daily horse ride in the field, Edward asked the knights accompanying him to race each other for fun and to test their horses. He himself remained on the sidelines, watching their competition. His guards, relaxed by routine and confident in their safety, willingly agreed to this innocent entertainment. While the knights competed at a distance, Edward calmly returned to his horse. But he did not simply return. He convinced his guards that one of the horses he had arrived on was lame. He ordered them to leave that horse behind and check it, while he mounted another, fresh and fast horse that had been prepared for him in advance. Suddenly, when the knights were far away and not expecting a trick, Edward sharply turned his horse and galloped away at full speed without looking back. He used the very horse that had supposedly been prepared for him for a ride, but which was actually one of the fastest in the area. The knights, stunned and having wasted a lot of time checking the lame horse, were unable to catch up with him. Shortly thereafter, Edward joined Count Gilbert de Clary and his troops, who were waiting for him at the agreed-upon location. De Clare was one of the most powerful barons in England, and his defection to the king's side brought enormous military and financial resources to the royal party. Now the king had not just an heir, but a brilliant military leader. Edward's escape signaled the beginning of the second phase of the war. The royal party instantly gained a new leader, while de Montfort's supporters, on the contrary, fell into despondency. Prince Edward immediately set about gathering the royal army, intending to end de Montfort's dictatorship with one decisive blow. Simon de Montfort was caught off guard. He realized that now he would have to face not the indecisive Henry III, but his talented and dangerous son. His power, built on shaky foundations, began to crumble rapidly. This story is definitely worth remembering, so please like the video. What you are about to learn will change your perception of the princes and kings of the past. After his escape, Prince Edward demonstrated not only courage, but also impressive military talent, which he undoubtedly inherited from his ancestors. The very fact of his daring return to the army amazed his contemporaries, as few expected him to be able to act so decisively after his long captivity. Edward immediately took control of the situation, as if the months he had spent in captivity had never happened. He assessed the situation, identified the enemy's weaknesses, and chose a strategy that gave him the initiative. His campaign was swift, precise, and completely disoriented Simon de Montfort, who did not expect such speed and force. The prince acted like a natural commander who senses when to attack and which directions to control first. Many chroniclers later noted that Edward showed himself to be a much more mature leader than could be expected of a young man of his age. He managed to inspire his soldiers, who were overcome with excitement and uncertainty after his escape, and in just a few hours turned them into a united and confident army. Thanks to this, The first steps of his campaign proved incredibly successful. Edward's first move was to join forces with the troops of Count Gilbert de Clare. This decision immediately strengthened his position, as de Clare had extensive experience and considerable resources that could shift the balance of power on the battlefield. Their combined army was named the Royalist Army, and this name quickly became a symbol of determination and offensive power. The soldiers felt that together they could oppose de Montfort with a real force that the rebels did not expect. This strengthened the army's morale and made it more united. The Royalist army immediately moved east to cut off de Montfort from his main sources of reinforcements and support in Wales and the south. The prince understood that time was against him and that he needed to attack before his opponent could gather all his forces. He hoped that a quick march would prevent de Montfort from preparing his defences or receiving reinforcements. Edward deliberately avoided direct confrontation until he had secured an advantage. This allowed him to gradually tighten the noose around his opponent, giving him no respite. Simon de Montfort was in Hereford at the time, gathering his forces, but he made a critical mistake by dividing his troops. This decision seemed reasonable to him, as he hoped to speed up the advance of his troops and increase pressure on the Royalists. However, he did not take into account that the loss of concentration of forces made his army vulnerable to the swift actions for which Edward was famous. Because of this, de Montfort was unable to react quickly to changes in the situation and was constantly late with his response. This created increasingly serious difficulties for him. His son, also named Simon, nicknamed Simon the Younger, led a separate detachment from the eastern counties, which was supposed to join his father. He moved confidently and did not expect the Royalists to intercept him, as he considered the route to be safe. However, he lacked the experience to foresee a possible ambush or attempt to surround him. He underestimated the speed with which Edward could move his troops. It was this division of forces that proved fatal for the rebels. Prince Edward, having received accurate information about the route of young Simon, made a brilliant tactical move. He understood that a strike against a separate detachment could completely destroy the enemy's plans and deprive de Montfort of important support. Edward turned his troops north, seeking to take the enemy by surprise and deliver an unexpected blow. He moved quickly and quietly, which made his maneuver particularly dangerous. Many in his army later recalled that this night march was one of the most tense moments of the entire campaign. After a swift night march, he suddenly attacked Simon's army while it was resting in the town of Kenilworth. This happened at dawn on August 1st, 1265, when the rebel troops were relaxed and completely unprepared for an attack. Edward chose the perfect moment when sleep and fatigue made the defense of the detachment particularly weak. His attack was so unexpected that many did not even have time to raise their weapons. The success of the first strike completely determined the outcome of the entire battle. The attack at Kenilworth was a complete disaster for de Montfort Jr. His troops were caught off guard, and in the first minutes of the battle, many experienced knights died before they could organize a line of defense. Most of the rest were taken prisoner, which effectively destroyed the core of his army. Simon the Younger himself, with a handful of knights, managed to take refuge in Kenilworth Castle, but his situation became desperate. He lost support and found himself isolated. His army was destroyed, and this battle significantly weakened the position of the rebellious barons. Now de Montfort the Elder had lost the most important part of his forces, on which he had been counting for further action. He understood that without his son's support, it would be much more difficult for him to hold his own against the Royalists. Panic and confusion began to spread among his supporters. This was a serious turning point in the entire campaign. Simon de Montfort the Elder, who was in Hereford, was forced to retreat south in an attempt to cross the River Severn and join up with the remnants of his son's army. He hoped that at least some of Simon the Younger's men would be able to make their way to him and strengthen his position. However, he acted hastily, as he understood that Edward was already close and that any delay could be fatal. His troops were tired, and morale among the men was gradually declining. All this made his retreat even more difficult. However, Edward anticipated this maneuver. He quickly occupied all the strategic crossings over the Severn, blocking de Montfort's retreat. Thanks to reconnaissance and quick reactions, he managed to close off all possible routes that his opponent could use. This proved his maturity as a military leader. De Montfort found himself in a situation where he had to act almost blindly. This forced Montfort to turn east. He realized that if he could not find a way to cross, his army could be completely surrounded. He tried to maneuver to avoid a direct confrontation with the royalists, but the opportunities for this were becoming increasingly limited. Each day reduced his room for maneuver. His troops began to tire and lose confidence in success. Simon de Montfort now found himself in a critical situation. He was cut off from his son, surrounded by superior enemy forces, and trapped between the River Severn and the approaching royal army. He knew that any decision he made would involve enormous risk. His men felt that the situation was becoming increasingly hopeless. With each passing hour, the pressure from the royalists intensified. He was forced to march east in the hope of finding another crossing or engaging Edward's army on unfavorable terms. Every step was accompanied by anxiety and fear, as the troops understood that the enemy was much stronger. De Montfort tried to maintain order and convince his men that all was not yet lost. But his maneuvers could no longer change the overall course of events. The tactical advantage was entirely on the side of the royal heir. Thus, thanks to his audacity and speed, Prince Edward not only escaped from captivity, but also destroyed half of the enemy's army in a few days and lured its leader into a trap. He proved that he was capable of acting decisively and intelligently, even when circumstances were not in his favor. His successes in this campaign were an important step on the path to his future glory. They showed that Edward possessed not only bravery, but also the ability to think like a true strategist. Simon de Montfort found himself cornered. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Apaches turned stones and dust into their main weapon of invisibility. Simon de Montfort, cornered, chose to make his way to the town of Evesham. Evesham was located on the banks of the River Avon, and its location on a bend in the river made it a natural fortress, but also a potential trap. De Montfort hoped to quickly cross the river and move east to avoid battle with Edward's superior forces. However, Prince Edward was already one step ahead. He understood the strategic importance of Evesham perfectly and quickly moved his army to occupy all approaches to the town. The royalist troops, divided into 3 columns, approached Evesham from the north, east, and south, completely blocking the town. Early in the morning of August 4th, 1265, Simon de Montfort, while staying at the Abbey of Evesham, received alarming news. Scouts reported the approach of a large army from the north. At first, de Montfort mistook them for the troops of his son, Simon the Younger. Seeing the banners, he reassured his men, saying that they had nothing more to fear. But soon his hopes were dashed. As the enemy army drew closer, Montfort was horrified to discover not only the royal lion on their banners, but also the coat of arms of Count Gilbert de Clare. Prince Edward, demonstrating his tactical acumen, ordered the use of the captured banners of the barons. Simon de Montfort, standing on a high tower, bitterly realized that he was in a hopeless situation. He was surrounded in the bend of the River Avon. The only bridge across the river was under the control of his enemies. The royalist army outnumbered his forces by almost 2 to 1. Realizing the gravity of his situation, the old count, according to chroniclers, said, "May God save our souls, for our bodies are doomed." He did not ask for mercy or try to escape. De Montfort was a warrior and decided to fight, knowing that this would be his last battle. He ordered his troops to leave the city and form a battle line on a small hill outside Ypres. It was the only relatively flat area that offered any chance of organized defense. He placed his veterans in the center and took his place in the front ranks. The fate of Simon de Montfort and his supporters was sealed. His army consisted of a small group of loyal knights, Welsh archers, and infantry. Prince Edward had a large, well-equipped army, determined to avenge the king's humiliation. The battle was not going to be a battle, but a massacre. De Montfort, despite his despair, retained his extraordinary willpower. He ordered his men to keep close formation so that the royalist cavalry could not break through their ranks. He knew that their only chance was to hold out as long as possible until darkness fell. Ready to learn about the thing that saved millions of lives? The Battle of Evesham, which took place on August 4th, 1265, was short but extremely brutal. Prince Edward, having learned from the lessons of defeat at Lewes, gave the enemy no chance to maneuver. He used a hammer and anvil tactic designed to destroy the barons' army, leaving them no chance of retreat. The royal army, formed in a crescent shape, attacked Montfort from 3 sides. The troops of the Earl of Clare struck from the east, while Prince Edward himself led his forces in an attack from the north. The barons were pinned down on the flanks by the river Avon, making retreat impossible. Montfort's army found itself in a classic pincer movement. Seeing the enemy approaching, Simon de Montfort led his knights in a desperate counter-attack. He hoped to break through the center of the royal army and find at least some breach in the encirclement. However, his attack faltered under the onslaught of superior forces. Montfort's knights fought with desperate bravery, but they were too few. The Welsh archers, who fought on Montfort's side, played a special role in the battle. They did their best to hold back the onslaught of the royalist cavalry, but in close combat their effectiveness was minimal. The Welsh were not professional infantrymen and soon began to panic. Unable to withstand the onslaught and seeing that retreat across the river was their only chance, the Welsh rushed towards the Avon. However, the river was deep and the banks steep, and many of them drowned trying to cross to the other side. The fiercest battle unfolded around Simon de Montfort himself. The royalist knights knew that victory would only be complete after his death. They surrounded his unit, and a desperate hand-to-hand battle ensued where no one asked for or gave mercy. Soon, Montfort's body fell to the ground. He was surrounded on all sides, and despite his bravery, he was unable to hold off dozens of attacking knights. With his death, the last remnants of the barons' resistance collapsed instantly. The battle turned into a merciless slaughter. The soldiers of the royal army, embittered by the long war and their desire for revenge, took no prisoners. They methodically destroyed everyone who fought on the Count's side. It was not just a military clash, but an act of retribution. The entire battle lasted no more than 2 hours. The barons' army was completely destroyed, and its leaders were either killed or taken prisoner. The royal army's success was complete and unconditional, cementing Prince Edward's reputation as an outstanding commander. How many people today do you think would be able to make a candle with their own hands? The Battle of Evesham had immediate and very cruel consequences for all participants in the Barons' Rebellion. In the first hours after the battle, it became clear that Prince Edward's victory had completely changed the political balance of power in the kingdom. Royal authority was fully restored, and a period of harsh and decisive retribution began, intended to show that resistance to the monarchy would not go unpunished. Many contemporaries described the atmosphere of those days as a time when the triumph of the monarchy was marked by a wave of repression that fell upon the defeated. For the supporters of de Montfort, this period was a real tragedy. The bodies of the slain barons, including Simon de Montfort himself, were put on public display as a grim reminder of the king's power. These cruel demonstrations were intended to warn anyone who dared to raise a hand against the legitimate monarch. Montfort's head was cut off, and his body was mutilated and cut into pieces, which made a strong impression even on those accustomed to the cruelty of medieval warfare. Such cruelty was intended to create an atmosphere of terror among the remaining supporters of the rebellion. It was also meant to reinforce once and for all the idea that the rebels had nothing to expect but punishment. These horrific actions did indeed demoralize many barons who still hoped to continue the fight. Those who saw the brutally mutilated body of Montfort understood that resistance would involve enormous risk and could lead to even more terrible consequences. The chronicles describe how the inhabitants of the surrounding settlements were shocked by what was happening and passed on details of the massacre to each other. This put additional pressure on those who were in hiding or had not yet laid down their arms. An atmosphere of fear gradually enveloped more and more rebels. King Henry III, who had been held captive by the leader of the rebellion during the battle, was rescued by his sons. His release was an important moment that strengthened the prestige of the royal family after months of humiliation. Henry immediately regained his throne and resumed his position as the formal head of state. However, the real power after the victory belonged to his son Edward, who became the chief architect of the post-war settlement. Many contemporaries understood that it was Edward, not Henry, who would determine the future of England. It was a triumph not so much for Henry III as for his talented heir. Edward's reputation now grew rapidly, as he proved himself not only a successful military leader, but also a politician capable of making difficult decisions. His rise to real power became obvious even to those who had previously doubted his abilities. The victory at Ypres cemented his image as a decisive leader who knew how to act quickly and confidently. This victory was a key step on the path to his future reign. After the battle, the so-called Parliament of the Disinherited was convened. This assembly became a tool with which the victors intended to completely break the resistance of the rebels. The Parliament passed a law depriving all participants in the uprising of their lands, titles, and property, which meant the complete destruction of their social status. It was one of the largest confiscations of property in the history of medieval England, and its consequences were felt for many decades to come. For the barons, this measure was a blow comparable to defeat in battle. Thousands of knights and barons found themselves destitute, having lost everything they owned. Families who had owned their estates for centuries were now deprived not only of their land, but also of their livelihoods. Many of them could not believe that the royal authority had decided on such a harsh step, as it destroyed the familiar structure of society. Some tried to seek support from neighbors or distant relatives, but most found no help. Social tensions in the kingdom grew. Such a harsh measure did not bring the peace that the royal court had hoped for. On the contrary, it provoked new local outbreaks of resistance that flared up in different regions of the country. Deprived of their inheritance, the barons, who had nothing left to lose, continued their armed struggle. They turned into robbers and partisans, hiding in forests and remote counties. These small but persistent groups often attacked royal caravans and the estates of supporters of the monarchy. With each passing month, more and more people joined these resistance groups as discontent grew. Local residents, suffering from the unrest, often supported them by providing shelter and food. This made the fight against them particularly difficult. The royal troops were forced to constantly engage in minor skirmishes, which depleted their resources and exhausted their soldiers. Instability reigned in the kingdom, threatening to escalate into a new crisis. Prince Edward, realizing that total retaliation would only prolong the conflict, began to look for a way to defuse the situation. He understood that further repression could lead to a new major uprising that would once again threaten royal power. Edward showed political flexibility that surprised even some of his supporters, who believed that the rebels should be punished even more severely. But the prince saw that a prolonged war was exhausting the entire country. In 1266, the Dictum of Kenilworth was issued, which softened the conditions for the defeated. This act was an attempt to restore stability to the kingdom and reduce the number of new conflicts. According to the dictum, the rebels could regain their lands by paying a large fine, the amount of which depended on the severity of their guilt. This decision gave them a chance to restore their position while allowing the royal authority to gradually calm the country down. Although the conditions were harsh, Many barons saw this act as their last chance to return to normal life. The victory at Ypres was of enormous significance for the future of the English monarchy. It temporarily put an end to the barons' attempts to establish control over the king through permanent councils and charters, cementing the principle of the inviolability of royal power. The crown was able to rule without fear of immediate and organized armed resistance. Prince Edward, who ascended the throne in 1272 as Edward I, became one of the most powerful and influential kings in English history. He learned the lessons of Evesham forever. A strong monarchy needs not only military power, but also legitimacy and support. He understood that the interests of the nobility and the people could not be completely ignored. Paradoxically, it was Edward I who defeated Simon de Montfort, who continued his most progressive political idea, the convening of a representative parliament. Edward I regularly convened a parliament that included not only barons, but also representatives of counties and cities. He did this not out of love for democracy, but for pragmatic reasons. The king used Parliament to approve new taxes, to legitimize his laws, and to consolidate the nation in his wars against Scotland and France. He realized that it was much easier to get approval for fundraising from a representative body than to argue with each baron individually. It was a tool for centralizing power. Thus, although Simon de Montfort died, his political legacy, the idea of representation, survived and became an integral part of the English political system. Kings learned that Parliament could be used to their advantage. Henry did not destroy Parliament, but transformed it from an instrument of baronial opposition into an instrument of royal administration. In the long run, this led to a unique situation in England, where the monarchy was strong, but at the same time had to interact with a representative body. This became the foundation for the constitutional monarchy that took shape centuries later. The Battle of Evesham was the end of baronial freedom, but not the end of political evolution. After the death of Simon de Montfort, his family and supporters were forced to flee England. His wife, Eleanor, the king's sister, and their children went into exile in France, losing all their possessions and titles. The Montfort family, which had ruled England just a year earlier, was now doomed to wander around Europe. The younger Simon, who had managed to take refuge in Kenilworth Castle, continued to resist for several months after Evesham. Kenilworth Castle, which belonged to the Montferrats, became the last stronghold of the rebels. Royal troops laid siege to it, and the siege lasted almost 6 months. In the end, the besieged, exhausted by hunger and disease, were forced to surrender. Prince Edward showed mercy and allowed them to leave the castle, sparing their lives but depriving them of all their rights and property. Young Simon, like his brothers, also went into exile, leaving England forever. However, the descendants of Simon de Montfort did not disappear from history. They found a place for themselves at the courts of continental Europe, especially in France and Italy. One of his sons, Guy de Montfort, became famous for his cruelty. He avenged his father by killing Henry of Alemannia, nephew of King Henry III, in Italy, right during Mass. This act of revenge shocked all of Europe and showed that the spirit of the Montforts was not broken. However, it only exacerbated the family's situation and cemented their reputation as enemies of the English royal house. In England, their name became synonymous with treason and rebellion, and people tried not to mention it in a positive light. Despite his death, Simon de Montfort left an indelible mark on the popular memory. For many, he became a symbol of freedom and a defender of the rights of the common people against royal despotism. His grave became a place of pilgrimage, and he was unofficially canonized by the people, who saw him as a martyr for the cause of the people. The Battle of Evesham became one of the most important lessons for the English monarchy. This battle showed that conflict between the king and his subjects could quickly escalate into a large-scale war that would bring destruction to the entire country. It served as a reminder that even victory does not spare the monarch from the consequences of his own mistakes. Many contemporaries noted that royal power was endangered not only by the strength of the rebels, but also by the political blindness of Henry III. It taught kings that open confrontation with a large, organized opposition can be deadly dangerous, even if the king ultimately wins. The victory at Ypres was not easy, and its price was enormous for both the crown and the entire country. English monarchs realized that open conflict with the United Barons could threaten the very existence of the monarchy. Interestingly, however, the main lesson was learned not by the kings themselves, but by their heirs, who studied the mistakes of their predecessors much more carefully. When Prince Edward became king, he tried to avoid the mistakes that had cost his father his power. He understood that power was based not only on military strength, but also on the ability to negotiate. He saw how dangerous it was to pressure the barons without taking their interests into account, and how easily discontent could escalate into war. Therefore, when he came to power, he exercised caution in matters that could lead to a new schism. Edward sought to create a system in which the crown remained strong, but did not provoke open hostility. He understood that violence must be combined with law and ambition with pragmatism. Edward sought to act in such a way that each of his steps appeared reasonable and legitimate, even if he was pursuing his own political goals. He did not rule as a tyrant, but he did not allow the barons to regain the upper hand over the crown, as had happened under his father. He skillfully created a balance in which no one could gain too much power. It was thanks to this that his reign became one of the most stable in medieval England. Edward I became a master of political compromise. He understood when to be firm and when it was better to offer negotiations to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. His ability to combine toughness with flexibility allowed him to strengthen royal power while retaining the support of most of the nobility. Many historians believe that his success was a direct result of the lessons learned after Evesham. He became a king who was able to learn from the mistakes of the past. Simon de Montfort, in turn, taught an important lesson on how to use popularity and political organization to fight for power. He understood that opposition could only be successful if it was supported by broad sections of society. He was the first to show that the support of a few large feudal lords was not enough to defeat the crown. A coalition was needed that included knights, townspeople, and even those who previously had no political voice. This is what made his movement so dangerous to the king. He was the first to show that defeating the crown required a broad coalition that included not only major feudal lords, but also knights, townspeople, and even peasants. Montfort managed to use public discontent to strengthen his own power and put pressure on the king. He attracted people who had not previously been involved in government affairs to politics, which was an important step in the development of English parliamentarianism. Thanks in large part to him, the idea of political participation gradually spread among different strata of society. He was the first to mobilize public opinion. His speeches, letters, and meetings attracted the attention not only of the nobility, but also of ordinary townspeople, who began to feel that their voices were also important. This was the beginning of a process that, centuries later, would lead to the formation of representative democracy. Despite his defeat, Montfort remained forever in the memory of the people as the man who tried to change the rules of the game. Evesham also showed how important military talent was in medieval politics. In those days, the power of a ruler depended directly on his ability to wage war, defend his possessions, and suppress rebellions. Prince Edward managed to demonstrate precisely those qualities that made him a true leader. He made decisions quickly, acted confidently, and knew how to exploit his opponent's weaknesses. Prince Edward's victory was the result of his brilliant tactical maneuvers, which allowed him to destroy the enemy army piece by piece. He divided the rebel forces, prevented them from joining together, and delivered a series of blows from which they could not recover. His ability to maneuver on the battlefield impressed even experienced knights. It was thanks to these maneuvers that the outcome of the Battle of Ypres was decided even before the main clash began. The military incompetence of de Montfort Jr. and the strategic error of the Count himself cost them their lives and their cause. Simon Jr. failed to protect his troops and committed an act of negligence that led to his defeat and the capture of the castle. The elder Montfort underestimated Edward's speed and lost control of the situation. These mistakes showed that even the strongest political ideas can collapse due to poor military decisions. In medieval England, a commander and a politician had to be one and the same. We conclude our study of the Battle of Evesham, the bloody finale of the Second Barons' War. This battle was not just the culmination of the conflict, but a decisive moment that determined the future path of England. On that day, on the field near Evesham Abbey, not only was Simon de Montfort's army destroyed, but also the barons' dream of permanent control over the crown. Prince Edward's victory secured unprecedented authority and power for the monarchy. The lessons of this war helped him, as King Edward I, to build a strong, centralized state, where Parliament, born in the crucible of rebellion, became an instrument of royal power. It was the end of medieval freedom and the beginning of a new era. Which of Simon de Montfort's tactical mistakes do you think was the most fatal? Dividing his forces or choosing the location for the decisive battle? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the great battles of the past.